Star Trek has always been more than a science fiction show. From the moment Gene Roddenberry pitched it to NBC in 1964, it was designed to operate on two levels simultaneously: an exciting adventure on the surface and a deeper, often uncomfortable conversation about humanity lurking underneath. Roddenberry understood something that most television executives of his era didn't: that by setting stories in distant galaxies with alien civilizations, you could say things about race, war, power, and human nature that would never survive a network notes meeting if set in a contemporary American living room. Science fiction was, for him, a kind of camouflage. For the most part, it worked. Star Trek became one of the most celebrated and culturally significant franchises in the history of entertainment. It featured one of the first multiracial casts on American primetime television. It tackled the Cold War, civil rights, gender equality, and the ethics of intervention in foreign conflicts, all dressed up in Starfleet uniforms and rubber alien masks. It inspired engineers, astronauts, and scientists. NASA named a prototype space shuttle after the fictional starship. The U.S. government's COVID-19 vaccine initiative was named Operation Warp Speed by a Star Trek fan working inside the FDA. Guinness World Records recognized it as the most successful science fiction television franchise in history, and in 2024, the entire franchise received the Peabody Institutional Award for its lasting impact on culture and society. But here is the thing about a show that never plays it safe. Sometimes it goes further than the world is ready to follow. Several episodes across the franchise's long history were pulled from broadcast, refused airtime, edited beyond recognition, or quietly shelved by networks that decided, rightly or wrongly, that their audiences simply weren't ready. And when you actually look at what those episodes contained, the reaction becomes entirely understandable. These weren't minor complaints from a handful of easily offended viewers. These were stories that disturbed people, that crossed lines, that made television executives in multiple countries reach for the off switch. Here are 3 Star Trek episodes that are still talked about today for exactly that reason. The episode begins like a mystery and turns into something far darker before the first act is over. The Enterprise receives a distress call from a planet that is inexplicably an exact duplicate of Earth. When the landing party beams down Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Yeoman Rand, and 2 security officers, they find a suburban landscape that looks like it was frozen somewhere in the early 20th century. Streets are empty. Buildings are decaying. The silence is the kind that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels wrong. That silence breaks almost immediately. A badly disfigured man lurches at the crew, convulses, and dies in front of them. Then a girl appears, small, frightened, darting away from the adults she calls grups, a child's corruption of the word grown-ups. Her name is Miri. She tells the landing party that she and the other children, the onlys as they call themselves, are the only survivors of whatever happened here. The adults all went mad and died. And now, as the crew notices purple sores beginning to appear on their own skin, they realize the disease that wiped out every grown human being on this planet has already begun working on them. The truth they uncover in an abandoned medical laboratory is genuinely chilling. The plague was not a natural occurrence. It was the accidental consequence of a life extension experiment gone catastrophically wrong. The children on this planet are not children in any normal sense. They are hundreds of years old, aging only a single month for every century that passes, yet their minds and emotions remain exactly as they were when the experiment began, which means they are ancient beings trapped forever in the psychological state of childhood. They don't fully understand time. They don't understand consequences. And when fear takes hold, that combination becomes genuinely dangerous. McCoy races to develop a vaccine as the crew's condition deteriorates. The situation becomes more desperate when John, an older boy who has become a de facto leader among the children, steals the crew's communicators. Without them, there is no contact with the Enterprise, no way to test the cure safely. The children, terrified and manipulated, capture Yeoman Rand and swarm Kirk until he is bleeding on the ground. The resolution comes not through force, but through reasoning. Kirk reaches the children by making them understand that without help from the adults, the youngest among them will die. John returns the communicators. McCoy tests the vaccine on himself in an act of calculated desperation. It works. The episode aired once on the BBC in 1970. The complaints that followed were significant enough that the network quietly dropped it from reruns for years. The concerns centered on the portrayal of children in peril, the disease imagery, the physical danger visited upon the crew, and the overall atmosphere of decay and helplessness that ran through the story. For viewers accustomed to science fiction as clean, optimistic adventure, the grimy hopelessness of Miri's world was something different, and something that a significant portion of the British broadcasting establishment decided was not appropriate for general audiences. What makes Miri endure as a conversation piece is precisely what made it uncomfortable then. It doesn't clean things up. The children are not simply innocent victims to be rescued. They are also a threat. The disease is not defeated through heroism, but through a scientist injecting himself with an untested formula. And the ending, while technically hopeful, leaves behind a planet full of ancient children who still don't fully understand what has happened to them or what happens next. It is a deeply unsettling episode, and it earned its reputation. If Miri disturbed audiences with disease and danger, Plato's Stepchildren disturbed them in an entirely different way, and in the process created a moment that television historians still write about more than 50 years later. The premise involves the Enterprise crew encountering a civilization that has modeled itself on ancient Greek philosophy, specifically the teachings of Plato. The inhabitants of this world have developed powerful psychokinetic abilities. They can move objects and, more disturbingly, control the bodies of other people simply through force of will. When Kirk and Spock beam down to assist an injured member of the society, they are quickly made prisoners, their bodies hijacked and forced to perform humiliating acts for the entertainment of their captors. The episode is, at its core, a story about power, cruelty, and what people do when they have the ability to completely control another person's physical autonomy. The moment that made history came when Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura, under the psychokinetic control of their captors, were forced toward each other and into a kiss. It was brief. It was clearly framed as coercion rather than desire. The characters are not choosing to kiss. They are being made to by beings who want to watch them suffer the humiliation. And yet, what appeared on screen was something American primetime television had not shown before: a kiss between a black woman and a white man. NBC had concerns, but they were not about the content of the scene itself. The network's worry was primarily about how local affiliates in the American South might react. The fact that almost no formal complaints materialized from those stations, that audiences across the country seemed, in the event, more prepared for this moment than network executives had feared, said something important about the gap between the assumptions of gatekeepers and the actual attitudes of viewers. The reaction in the United Kingdom was different. When the BBC evaluated the episode for broadcast, they declined to air it. The official explanation was that the story was too brutal, and there is truth in that. The episode contains genuinely disturbing sequences of psychological torment and the degradation of the crew. But many observers over the years have suggested that the real calculation was more complicated, that the episode's most famous moment was a factor in a decision made by a broadcasting establishment that preferred to avoid the controversy entirely. Whatever the true reasoning, the episode was kept off British screens, and its absence itself became part of the story of what Star Trek was willing to do that the world wasn't entirely ready for. Today, the episode occupies an unusual place in the franchise's legacy. The kiss is cited in virtually every serious discussion of television's role in reflecting and shaping cultural norms around race. Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, later described a pivotal moment in her own relationship with the show when she told Gene Roddenberry she was considering leaving the series and then attended an NAACP event where she met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King told her that Star Trek was the only program he and his wife allowed their children to watch and urged her not to leave, telling her she was part of history. She stayed, and the history she was part of became larger than anyone involved in that episode could have fully anticipated. The third episode on this list takes the Enterprise to one of its darkest destinations, not in terms of physical space, but in terms of psychological territory. The setup is routine enough. The crew is delivering a shipment of advanced medicine to Elba 2, a remote planetoid that serves as a maximum security facility for the Federation's most dangerous, criminally insane individuals. It is the kind of stop that should take no time at all. It becomes a nightmare within minutes. The patients have taken control of the facility. At the center of that takeover is a man named Garth of Izar, once a celebrated Starfleet captain whose tactical brilliance was legendary, now completely unhinged, operating under the delusion that he is destined to conquer and rule the galaxy. What makes Garth particularly dangerous is that he has somehow acquired the ability to shape-shift, to alter his physical appearance and voice to perfectly replicate another person. He uses this ability to manipulate everyone around him while working toward his real objective, seizing the Enterprise. From the moment Kirk and Spock arrive on the surface, they are in Garth's trap. What follows is not simply a physical confrontation, but a sustained psychological assault. Garth plays elaborate mind games, testing Kirk's resolve, attempting to break his spirit, and using fear as a management tool on the other inmates. The cruelty is not incidental to the story, it is the point. In one particularly stark moment, Garth executes another patient simply to demonstrate that he can, simply to show that he holds the power of life and death in that environment and intends to use it without hesitation. The climax arrives when Garth uses his shape-shifting ability to impersonate Kirk, forcing Spock into an impossible situation. Two identical figures claiming to be the real captain and no obvious way to determine which one is telling the truth. The resolution, when it comes, relies on Spock's logic and his deep knowledge of who Kirk actually is, a relationship that the show had spent years building, and that pays off here in a moment of genuine dramatic tension. The BBC determined that this episode was too disturbing for family television audiences. The combination of madness portrayed without redemption, torture used as entertainment by one of the characters, sudden shocking violence, and the sustained atmosphere of psychological instability pushed it beyond what the network was comfortable placing in a general broadcast slot. The decision followed a pattern that had already emerged with other original series.